Next up will be Matt McKnight, our general manager for Biosecurity, who can talk about how we're growing that business and in particular moving it towards national security. So,
thanks, Jen. Thanks, Jason. Cool. I'm excited to be here. This is something we haven't had a chance to talk about as much publicly, so it should be a really good discussion. I am going to endeavor to do about 15 minutes, and so please do ask questions. This is definitely a topic that there are a lot of questions about, and just in how the market is developing, so it's super good to hear how people are thinking about it. I'll do like two halves. I'll do a little bit of like footing of how we're thinking about what is happening in biosecurity, biodefense, like in the world that we are all living in, and then very specifically go into like how we're thinking about product development, where we're deploying what we are deploying as a product, and how we're thinking about sales. Maybe the first piece, Ginkgo, we've had two choices basically, and like it's actually important to identify these as two choices. The first choice is when you're building a cell engineering platform, you're on the forefront of biological engineering. You can choose to care deeply how that platform is deployed, or you can choose not to, right? And I think very clearly you've heard from us, we care very deeply how people use this technology. It is a transformational set of capabilities for the world. And so we've chosen both to do that in how we talk about it in the world, how we engage in everything from policy to our own decisions internally, but also with technology. So the first piece is build biosecurity technologies so that people on our platform are able to build things responsibly. And that's a 25-year objective. The second one, which is a little bit less kind of obvious as a choice, is you could pick that and make sure everybody that does things on the Ginkgo platform is doing things in a biosecure or a safe and secure manner with technology. Or you could also say we need to make those technologies available to the world, because also, by the way, in the world, biology does not respect borders. Every country in the world is going to need to deploy these capabilities like they deployed cybersecurity. But it's a conscious choice, and I would say that we've made that conscious choice to build this business to make it available globally, not just for companies on the Ginkgo platform. And I think the very blunt like why to do that is if you look at what happened in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity was not a market category that any of us would have like in 1960 been like, oh, you know what? There's going to be a huge market category of technology companies across the world building amazing capabilities in cybersecurity. And today, obviously, it's something that is hugely thought of as an important category within the computer engineering ecosystem. Obviously, to us, we believe there's going to be, and why we use like the little b, not on this slide, little b biosecurity is because we believe it'll be an industry category. There's going to be a huge ecosystem of technology companies building biosecurity capabilities in a bioengineered future. And Ginkgo absolutely should be the leading company building into that market. And I don't think it's 10 years. I think it's 2, 3, 5, 7 years you're going to see this category emerging. It is just kind of like the historical fact as you invent new engineering disciplines that you also invent the security components of those. So kind of one, we've chosen to make this a global business. Two, we believe it's a big market coming up. I think the second one, and Jason alluded to this, like the reality here is that the threat kind of envelope that the world is seeing from biology, now that's natural, mistake, and engineered, is changing dramatically. And like if you spend time talking to people in DC, policymakers, everything from ChatGPT plus bio all the way to the kind of massive diffusion of capabilities both in scale and kind of distribution and power, what nation states are doing behind the scenes with investing in high security laboratories. The threat envelope of bio is being identified as clearly not just, and certainly there's going to be benefits to public health, but not just a episodic pandemic boom and bust, we need to be prepared kind of, and it is being seen by the places where like annual budgets are spent to do preparedness, i.e. DoD, national security type communities, not just in the US, but everywhere. This is becoming a massive category of concern, and you can see it in the documents that have come out. But I think that the key point to think about there is that when in every point of history, when you've had a new threat category turn into a national security concern, whether that was nuclear weapons through to cyber, the persistent budgets, we spend over $1 trillion a year in the United States of America on DoD plus the intel community. The persistent budgets for preparedness change the market dramatically. And this is my favorite. So this is the National Biodefense Strategy, and you can just go back in the last 18 months. The number of policy documents that have a decidedly different tone on how to think about biodefense is pretty substantial. And so this last line, this is actually new. In like the vision for how DoD thinks about this. It used to be like, oh, these are the 7 bad things and only these bad things we should worry about. This is, it comes from anywhere, and we seek to create a world free from catastrophic biological incidences. Like that, the only other statement of that is, that's an acknowledgement that there's basically 2 things that, and not to overdo it, but like 2 things that can kill tens of millions of people in a very short period of time, and it's nuclear weapons and bio. And that is the national security community saying we're not going to let that happen. Once that flows through the system, that changes the following, which is they look for technology to answer that problem because it's not just a policy problem. And so this is where this like big emerging, kind of Sham led it, Palantir doing this for complicated data problems, Anduril's doing it for robots, right? This is where the defense tech ecosystem, where American technology companies need to provide, that's the way our system works, need to provide capabilities for these big categories of threat, becomes a symbiotic relationship between government and the private sector. And that's certainly what we're thinking about on the biosecurity side. How do we build into that demand for like cutting edge technologies in biodefense? So then you ask, okay, like what is that in reality? Like what does that look like from what is the tech stack? What is the product stack for biodefense or biosecurity? The cool thing is you don't actually have to like invent anything new here. Like this is a lesson that has been learned over and over again in the national security community. Like it's the defensive targeting cycle, essentially. If you are looking for, Jason used the analogy before, if you are worried about somebody shooting a missile, what you are doing is you are constantly watching. Every day, every second, persistent, pervasive monitoring. If you're worried about cyber threats, you're monitoring every 0 and 1 at all times. Most of them are boring. Usually, you're not finding anything. You're persistent, pervasively monitoring. You are then prioritizing and characterizing those threats into what is concerning. By the way, this is, especially in bio, this is where AI is going to be incredibly important over time. If you're trying to shorten the time from detection to mitigation, which is how national security thinks about this, you have to be able to monitor data and figure out what's important very quickly. And then you get to what we're actually like relatively better at, which is where almost all the resources are going today, which is medical countermeasures, vaccines, therapeutics, right? We think a lot about how to develop drugs and other things to mitigate the thing that we don't know is showing up. And so the big change moment, we believe, is this is what's missing. If you want to think about it from a DoD tech stack standpoint, or from a national security tech stack standpoint, what we are missing is persistent, pervasive monitoring so that you can enable rapid response. So all 3 of these things need to be built, by the way, right? Where we see the need, really, and what is kind of in significant demand relative to where there's a lot of expertise is in that first piece. Also, we are not insane. If you read all those documents, like the national security community of the world, like has figured this out, right? And the most recent, this is the Biodefense Posture Review. I love it. They actually, I thought it was very, for the first time, like, very thoughtful about saying, essentially, we need to build early warning around genomic sequencing. Early warning and genomic sequencing. Why? Because that is what and I'll talk about it in a second, that's the high fidelity data asset that you can get novel information from. And then second, the bottom one is the UK this summer launched their biological security strategy. Super neat, because it's language that we've been using for 18 months. Their kind of top priority is launch biothreats radar. Turns out that in the physics engineering era of the 1930s, the UK were the first to launch radar. This is the same thing. It's literally launch biothreats radar to get early warning. Okay, so like, this is my favorite analogy, just to go like nerdy for 1 minute, right? So in the 50s and 60s, we invented the high altitude camera, right? So we had the ability to take pictures from high atmosphere or space of land. That was a new technology, like snap picture, have cool picture of ground, right? And what was neat, Edwin Land, who was the CEO of Polaroid at the time, said, wow, this is going to be a new domain of comprehensive intelligence that we don't have, and it's going to be useful for national security purposes. Oh, by the way, we're going to be able to see where the Soviets have nuclear weapons and whether they're spinning them up or doing something weird with them. But also, it's going to be super useful for economic purposes down the road. And then they're kind of like, well, also we just need to figure out how to get these cameras up high. That's the issue. So if you look at the history of the U-2, and if you go to the National Air and Space Museum and you actually look at a U-2, you're like, it is an amazing plane, but it is like a piece of metal built solely to get a camera up really high. It is the system around the first generation high altitude cameras so that we could take pictures over the Soviet Union above surface to air missile height. And then play that through, you get satellites, better system, better cameras. And then ultimately, over the course of 3 decades, you get this really substantial industry, which is commercial companies running satellites, or to mix metaphors, radars, taking pictures of things, feeding data for national security purposes. Almost the vast majority of national security imagery today is not owned by the government. It is commercial satellites feeding national security organizations, and also feeding the private sector. So if you can think about that, that's a high fidelity data asset, pictures turned into a really substantial business model. What I love about what we're building is this transition to product. So you would not have built this except for COVID, but we spent a lot of time and effort building what is essentially, very neat, the operating system, the U-2, if you will. Does not look like an airplane. It would be cooler if it did. The operating system around what is today the genomic camera, the sequencer. So the sequencer, 20 years of genomics revolution, still super nascent. Illumina, Oxford, everybody else has done a great job getting those 2 places. Almost every country that we visit in the world, and I spent basically the last 24 months on the road globally because governments are the customer, have sequencers, but they use them for very niche purposes. It is not the high altitude version. They are using them for clinical. They are using them for the high-end diagnostics, but they're not using them as a general purpose aperture to take pictures of DNA and RNA of the planet where the bio threats will emerge from. And so what we've been able to build is essentially an end-to-end software and services system, the software that runs a radar station, and stamp it around sequencers around the world and work on biosecurity, biosurveillance programs with countries that are looking to utilize their installed assets more effectively. So when we go in, we don't need to buy assets, we don't need to buy sequencers. We are building a system end-to-end which collects data from airplanes, that's our CDC program, moves it through to a lab and feeds genomic data off the other side into a usable form for biothreat detection. And that is the core set of assets that we're able to take and deploy. Now, what we think of this as is much more like a software problem than a wet lab biology problem. So now, once we have sequence data coming off, each day we are just versioning newer and newer assays and analytics into the system. So folks have read about, we have one program that we did with IARPA, which is the intelligence community's DARPA, where we're essentially a good old-fashioned AI version of comparing sequence data against known natural and known engineered sequences, where we can determine if something has been genetically engineered or not. That's just a software package that goes on top of diversion, a radar station, and we're constantly thinking about what are the next detection algorithms that we can put on top of this network. And that gives us a lot of stickiness with our partners, countries around the world, who are constantly looking for better and better detection because they all have this security mandate in their own countries and are also interested in preventing what frankly happened over the last 3 years, or what they're all seeing in the threat surface coming up. We've taken a very laser-focused approach to deploy this country by country by country. Again, because for the near term, countries are the customers because they have the national security mandate. That is who spends resources to secure their populations first. So we're operating 8 international airports. 8 international airports. We've announced 11 MOUs. We're monitoring essentially just over 100 countries because we're getting flight origin, and that gives us unique data that nobody else has about how pathogens are flowing around the world. I'll give you a sense of, so you can understand our press releases. This is essentially our enterprise sales model. What we do is we go in and we look for countries that are interested in investing in biosecurity overall, and we sit down with them. We talk to them about what is it going to look like to deploy biosecurity capabilities in the 21st century. We start scoping that out. We generally, the way it works with countries, sign an MOU to then explore things further in a program design mode. We're almost always starting with airport programs, but not exclusively. And so this is an example of what we were doing in Botswana, which we've announced. We signed an MOU. We've had teams going back and forth, scoping out monitoring programs, and we'll be launching that one, and then they move into operational programs. These have no money associated with them. This is where you get into paying programs, and our view is that we should be the biosecurity infrastructure and partner for allied nations around the world. And that's essentially how we're thinking about the process of expanding our footprint, expanding our biosecurity network. To kind of come back to the beginning and close, I think there's a very cool synergy that happens over time, and it's not a long period of time, between biosecurity at Ginkgo and cell engineering. To build that defensive targeting cycle that we're talking about, detection to prioritization, characterization, to building mitigation or enabling mitigation, medical countermeasures, vaccines, therapeutics, you have to have the whole arc. You have to have the network of the whole arc. And over time, we very much see both sides of Ginkgo's business feeding each other to kind of close the loop from biothreat detection to mitigation and response. This is certainly like how you think about detection, deciding, and responding over time, enabling a network of partners, something we are playing for, but today we are laser focused on how do you build that network that we just talked about, how do you deploy the bioradar systems most effectively. I think that's all I have, and happy to answer questions.
Can you give a couple of examples of the last 6 to 9 months where you have detected things and you have to do something, because it seems they will always react to things.
Yeah, I think our favorite example, which was an early proof point, when BA2 Omicron came out, we detected it 42 days before it was found clinically. Because this is the big, so like the big transition is not that you should replace current surveillance systems, current monitoring systems, which are mostly or most often clinically based, right? Somebody shows up, they're sick, flag it. It's that you should build a layered system. So that was a very cool example. We were able to flag that to CDC. They were able to characterize it, understand, what the flow in and out of the country was. And what, in that case, it's a public health use case, right? It is, let me make nursing homes aware that a new highly transmissible variant is coming. This was a very cool example of an end-to-end where we were still serving nursing homes kind of during the outbreak mode. And we were able to notify nursing homes in our network with kind of 42-day, 43-day notice that there was this variant that was showing up on the shores. They were able to reinstitute masking policies, push vaccines, et cetera, in their own communities. So that's a public health use case, is just a little bit more early warning. What we're starting to see now, we're working, we've done pilots with the CDC flu program. So you can imagine identification and collection of flu variants from the southern hemisphere, being able to go directly into the vaccine manufacturing process, and that's something that's been explored just in kind of a pilot mode.
So just on this flu issue, how much can people, the pharma companies compress and identify exactly what strain they need to do? Because so far it's like hit and miss, you're guessing which strain is going to work. So with this, how much, can you shorten the time frame?
Yeah, like our view, so I think the 100-day like mission is like very lofty, but I also think that from a technology aspiration standpoint, we should be thinking about how we collapse that even more. And our view is the biggest gains are in how early you detect all the variants that are circulating, and then there's a separate piece of how you model those variants, right? But I don't have a great answer for like what the art of the possible is, but kind of like in every other domain, we've been able to take and shorten timelines far more dramatically than I think our aspirations are today.
Last question.
Yeah.
What's the pushback you get from customers when you go and try to sell your service? What are they saying?
Yeah, I still think it's I still think we fight through just, this is not about COVID. right? So this is about understanding that you've got to be multi-pathogen detection. A lot of times people will say, well, if it's coming through an airport, there's delay 5-6 days before we get sequences. Like, what are you going to do? And our general view is that the two things. One, you have to start with 5 or 6 days. That gives you a lot more early warning than you used to have, i.e. people showing up in the clinic. My favorite analogy on this, by the way, as a side note, is when we launched regular radar in the 1930s, the first use case was like flying airplanes to look for U-boats that were hitting Atlantic shipping going between England and the US. And we were like, I don't know what the exact date is, but we're like successful 5% of the time. Nobody was like, you know what, we should stop detecting 5% of the U-boats. We should just get better, right? And so a lot of the times you get the pushback from folks who are like, sequencing is too slow. It's only detecting these three, when we first launched, we usually do COVID flu. It's only detecting these 2 or 3 pathogens. Like, we want to do it all now. And we're like, okay, but you have to start laying infrastructure, and then you have to build this plan that we were talking about to deploy that over a number of years so that you actually have comprehensive detection. But we fight this battle of like, it's not the all-seeing eye today, but it will be, and trying to get people activated even around that. Yeah, that's cool. I love that second question. I love the first one question too. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize. I was informed that I needed to do that, and then I failed miserably. The question was, first, like, how should we measure how well this is going? And then the second was, are you still just doing wastewater, or how do you think about other modalities like air, et cetera? First one is, I think the best, I mean, look, this is a market that's building, right? And we're watching governments change their biodefense posture like monthly. But I think the right way to think about it is that like enterprise sales pipeline, if you will. Like, we're able to announce MOUs, and every one of those MOUs we're in engagements, some fast, some slower, talking to people about what their program design is. Sometimes countries are willing to announce the operational program. It's really not on us. We'd love to announce all of them. Sometimes they want to hold and like see it working, but it's really like, we can show you that top of the pipeline of the MOUs, and then kind of those flow through. That'd be the best answer I can give you on that one. On the modality side, this is why we think about his infrastructure. And Ashish Jha, who has been a great thought partner for us, both before he went into government and in government, he said this really, really well about the CDC program. He's like, look, is it wastewater? Is it airplanes? What we're laying is biosurveillance infrastructure. And so that's exactly how we think about this operating system. We are sample agnostic. Like, right now, it's a lot of I'll answer your question directly, but it's a lot of wastewater, but we're also doing, in Rwanda, the US, other places, we're also doing different types of samples, all anonymous, focused on non-human biological data, so we have a very hard line on that. But and then we're starting to pilot air in airplanes. Like, why wouldn't we go to that? But it's really, the key thing is, like, you got to get to sequences. It's not about yes, no detection. We're like really focused on getting to sequences.
This year, you guys talked about 100 million plus of biosecurity revenue, 50% of which is recurring. As you are deploying platforms, the one application of which could be COVID testing, how do you actually delineate between like what's recurring and what's not?
Yes. No. I think the big picture way to think about that is the 3 years of COVID response dollars, which essentially ended on June 30th, versus long-term national security programs. That's the most detail I can give you right now, but you can look at it. June 30th it's all public, it was the last day officially of kind of the federal dollars that ended with the May 11th public health emergency being over. And so it's really, how do you think about the transition to long-term national security? Always with the infrastructure in place, if something else happened, that we can spin it up super fast, right? Like, that's can't think about what that looks like over time, nor is it the foundation of the business, but there is that kind of, the kind of emergency response capability that could spin up super fast.
So like 50% would be kind of PCR testing, and the other half is sequencing and infrastructure and partnerships. What's the products you're selling?
I'll leave that for later. Yeah. Yes. Last question, by the way, was how do you disambiguate between non-recurring and recurring revenue, plus or minus? How do you disambiguate between those two, PCR testing to sequencing and bioradar type work? Just to repeat the last question. So this question is, if I say back to you, like, first one is kind of, why wouldn't anybody just do this? Like, what's unique about what you guys are doing? Are you just comparing these to databases and finding new variants? And then the second half, say the second half again.
Just around sort of governments not.
Oh yeah, government's putting their head in the sand. Government's not wanting to know the information. Yeah. So in the first half, like, one of the like really cool things that we've been working very hard on, and it's like the outward-facing version of what we do every day here at Ginkgo, like a massive, highly complex bioinformatics and computational bio kind of expertise. We've kind of, for the first time at scale, basically turned a separate version of the team which lives inside of biosecurity and pointed that out. So we work very closely inside on everything that you're going to hear about AI later, et cetera. But it's not just about can we run sequence data and compare it to variant databases. They're constantly looking for novel variants, running custom computational tools against that, against the data that's coming across for many of these countries in partnership with the smaller, kind of by definition, less capable bioinformatics teams, in each country. We're essentially running remote bioinformatics for a lot of our customers. So it is very much a core kind of piece of our value proposition. When I say like versioning the operating system, that's very much what I'm talking about. On the second side, it's like it is clearly a dynamic that happens. Like, do governments like hesitate to know? I think we're seeing that like go away pretty rapidly. It's like it is for the previous question of like, what do governments push us on? Like, do we want to know? We can get through that pretty quickly. And as the network has gotten big enough, enough places are able to kind of share their data, so it's not, and we see how global air travel works. Like, people have realized that it's not like you can stop it from going one place to another. You actually want to know early enough, and one country is like willing to share their data because they will know it earlier. And there is still like a public good component to this that people are pursuing. We haven't. I think where the big question marks will come in is when when you get into the really serious, really serious diseases, and you start finding those in places you didn't expect. But generally, people realize that they really do want to know that information. But it's a question that people ask a lot. Yeah.
Can you talk about the market dynamics? I'm talking about globally, because the MOUs that you have are typically mostly in the Middle East and in Africa. Is that because like UK or Europe or doing their own initiatives, and do you think you'd be able to expand geographically?
Yeah. So there's like 3 layers of this question. This kind of integrated service for biosecurity. Globally, the market dynamics, to be really direct, where we run into other companies, it's really BGI in building strategic biosecurity, biodefense relationships with countries. That's kind of who we see when we're talking about this category. That's a global market dynamic. Separately, I think you will, and I can't talk about all of it today, you will see kind of the more technically developed economies coming online with similar versions, and I think we see a market there for sure. Even being an American company, it's just a developing market, and they also have homegrown capabilities that are more substantial. Whereas in a lot of the more kind of nascent biotech markets, people are starting from scratch. And they know they're not going to develop homegrown solutions. So they're like, okay, we want to invest in this like we invest in cybersecurity. We know we had to buy cybersecurity from Norton and McAfee and whoever. We know we're going to have to buy biosecurity from somewhere. Where do I want to buy it from? Do I want to buy it from Ginkgo? Do I want to try to buy some Illumina sequencers and then hire some bioinformaticians and do it myself? Or do I want to buy it from BGI, which is a solution that is available? And so that's kind of like the choice set that we're seeing. And the question was, what are the market dynamics? I'm like doing good afterwards, Megan.
We have one question from online from Eric at Kahuna Capital Biotech. For biosecurity, which I agree needs more love from investors, do you see any addressable markets in the private sector, or will governments be the exclusive consumer of this product line for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, it's a super good question. So, oh yeah, well, yeah. So for those in the room, the question was, biosecurity needs way more love from investors. I think that was the first part. But the second part was, do you see private sector customers emerging, or will the foreseeable future be government customers only? And I think the short answer, I showed that the Edwin Land kind of how did GeoInt develop as a dual purpose data assets that you could turn into dual purpose national security, governments, and private sector tool. I mean, we don't have Zillow today without that, right? Or Google Maps, et cetera. 100% do we believe that the DNA and RNA of the planet will be a high fidelity data asset that will be commercializable both by governments and private sector. It is the foundation of what we think about here from a cell engineering standpoint at Ginkgo, like absolutely. And I think the nearest term use cases in biosecurity, you would see that is like things like supply chain management, right? Like what happens when CVS stocks out of Tylenol in Arizona because they didn't know RSV was going to spike? That's insane. Like we should know that that's happening. That's a pretty basic like biosurveillance and monitoring projection question, right? Like, and you looked at the supply chain kind of management that happened via HHS and friends of ours during COVID. That the infrastructure for like sharing how you should distribute medical products around the U.S. already exists. We just don't have the data feed on the front end to do it proactively. Now, that's all well and good. We do think that that's a little further out. There's a lot that needs to go into that to make it a really viable data feed. So I'd say not for the next 10 years, but like next 2-4 years, like the 100% like the major customers are governments. Like that is without hesitation. And that's certainly where we're focusing our time. National security almost always comes first before commercial applications of this stuff, if you look at like kind of the history of deployment of them. Great. Thanks, everybody.